Hi, welcome back to the HornThrowers podcast. We are joined by Bill to talk about his forthcoming book. Um, very excited. Yeah.
Yeah. We
Yeah,
usually
thank you for having me.
that's okay. We usually start off like, what was your introduction to music, like extreme music, and also what with this one we want to say what was your introduction to the world of metal studies? 'Cause I know it's quite a diverse subject that covers like anthropology, like history, philosophy, like any of the humanities can be applied to, and it's a very interesting
Mm.
uh thing. And
Like,
as it's already started, Ted has started rattling the cage. So
it
I will
has like a
listen
sixth
as I
sense
go and
for it.
let him out.
Sure. So my intro to metal or like extreme metal was kind of funny. I don't know how much of a widespread cultural reference this is, but there's a website called like GameSpot and they do like video game reviews, that kind of thing. They used
Hmm.
to have quite an extensive like forum in the days of like very early Facebook. It might have even been around pre-Facebook, but I'm not sure. But
Like
I
kind of
was
like,
part of sorry, you go.
oh no,
Well,
I just like sort of like primitive message boards from like back in the day,
yeah,
basically. It's like okay, cool.
yeah. When you actually used to have like message boards and not just different subreddits, more or less.
Mhm.
Um, and I was in the metal group in kind of on the GameSpot forums, and at that point, I was only really listening to what was derogatorily referred to as like dad metal, so like power metal, heavy metal, some symphonic stuff, like the lighter side of thrash. So like less Slayer and more like Anthrax, for example.
Hmm.
Um, and then just over time, I started being and like between that and lurking on the Metal Archives forums quite a bit. Over time, I just sort of started getting more interested in the more extreme stuff. And my way into it was through like symphonic black metal. So like
Hmm.
Emperor, Dimmu Borgir, like the pretty like it's quite I imagine it's quite standard to get into black metal through that connection because like I feel like it resonated quite well with my like over the top, like corny symphonic, like power metal kind of phase that I was going through. Um, and through particularly listening to Emperor, I think I just started exploring the more old school black metal. So, like, Dark Throne, Phasm, Mayhem, like the standards, really. Um, and it's funny because I've heard this from a few people who I've talked to as well, but like I started out listening to basically every genre of metal. But the further I got into black metal, the less I listened to of everything else. So
Yeah.
like towards the end of the book, I talk to Uncumber, like the musician from Gelassenheit, this like really strange religious socialist black metal band. Um, and she said more or less that like she like black metal is the only genre of metal she listens to, which is interesting, I think. And like when I was offered the book from Repeater initially, they said, "Oh, hey, like they didn't specify black metal; they just said extreme metal, which might include, like death metal, grindcore, sludge." But like I kind of told them like it has to be black metal because I don't really listen to anything else extensively. Like I like those genres. Like I like the new kind of movements in sludge metal particularly, but I don't really have any I don't have the broader familiarity with them that I do with black metal.
I think
Yeah.
it's interesting as well because a lot of the guests that we've interviewed have actually not had like a traditional route into metal and really only kind of like enjoyed black metal because they got into it through like punk and hardcore punk and then crust punk and then that gave way
Mhm.
to black metal. So it's like it's very interesting how that can become like an all-consuming thing. And I definitely at the height of when of my enjoyment of black metal, I was only consuming that as well.
Yeah. My intro to black metal was different. It was I liked Later Battery, and you were like, just go backwards through each album. When you get to the first album,
Mm.
you'll know. And then I'm like, oh yeah, now I'm listening to
I,
absolute
I was kind of like
noise to outsiders, but I think it's
I
great.
I was kind of like your like black metal Yoda.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because Bathory later on, like it's basically I'm not going to say it's power metal because it's not, but it's like heavy metal and like folk kind of stuff. And like there's a lot of like I've got a mate as well who basically got into black metal through like folk music, through the resonances between that. So it's interesting how, yeah, you can have many sort of different uh passages towards the same thing.
Yeah, like definitely a lot of the Scandinavian folk metal bands, like vocally borrow and in other elements of the music borrow an awful lot from black metal. Like things like Interferum,
Yeah.
like the gap between a band like Windear, who are like black metal, and like something like early Interferum is not that large of a gap,
Mm.
to be honest. So I can see how somebody could make that jump pretty quickly.
It's quite wide anyway. If you listen to like Bergtat by Olva, like that has got straight up folk in it for like
Yeah.
well, after the first song really it gets quite folky.
There's flutes and everything, it's
Yeah.
great.
And I never used to like folk metal, and now I'm here wearing a Skalmold shirt after we went to see Fintroll and Skalmold yesterday. And now I'm like
Nice.
sold completely.
Sat here with my flute.
Yeah. So so that's how you got into metal. So how did you then get into like the academic side? Did you was that through university, like studying like humanities or something, or was that just a personal
Mm.
interest?
Um, it's just personal interest. Like I'm not an academic. Um, I work in a high school is my day job. But basically, the book, the book sort of forced me to get involved with like metal study stuff because I I didn't reach out to Repeater first. Like they reached out to me. Like they found something. Tariq Goddard, like the main guy at Repeater, found something that I wrote in like my second year of uni about it was like an essay kind of thing on the album Kentucky by Panopticon,
Oh, it's
which
amazing.
is like a great album.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of a progenitor of a lot of like RABM stuff and its popularity, which is really great. But I sort of wrote about that album and like the politics of it and like the ecological politics of it particularly. Um, and he just kind of found that randomly. That's the story I've heard anyway, that he found it randomly and then Carl Neville, he basically had Carl Neville from Repeater find and contact me. I'm like, okay, that's cool, I guess. Um, but like in terms of my academic interests and stuff, like I studied anthropology and literature at university. So there is always this, that's why there's so much anthropology in the book, is because like that's where I'm coming from, I suppose. Um, and there was never really like an intentional choice to make a how do I put it? To make like an intervention in metal studies or whatever. Like it's not an academic work in that regard. It was the book was really just a product of me wanting to kind of smash my two interests together with like the black metal and the kind of like communist philosophy and politics and that sort of thing. So yeah.
If someone had seen my essays from university, then they wouldn't be impressed. I did film studies and wrote about
You did a Marxist reading of
Marxist reading of
RoboCop.
RoboCop, and the best one was like a Marxist reading of Nicolas Cage and how he's like both like high Hollywood, but he can also, because he's like his acting style is so weird, he can also play like roles in really weird anti-capitalist stuff.
Mm.
It's flick between the two worlds. So I
Yeah,
was
like
I'm gonna go. Yeah, I was like, I'm gonna go for the
I've
weirdest things I can go for.
mm. Yeah, like I've gone back since then and read that Panopticon essay, and like I hate it now. Like I can't. Like I wrote it probably in like what 2017, I think, and looking at it now, like no, that's horrendous. Like yeah,
I
and it's
see. I
funny because the website. Oh, sorry,
Oh,
Rob,
no,
you go
sorry.
ahead.
There's a little bit of like a lag. So like when I think that you finish speaking, it's actually yeah. I know I was gonna say like it's sad that you dislike it because like my next question was gonna be like, can you send me that please so I can read it because that was one of my favorite albums that's come out in the last 10 years. So
No, sure, absolutely, but like it's funny because I hosted it like I put it for free on my friend's website that he ran at the time, and maybe like 6 months after that he sold the website and the new owner has like removed all of the author names from everything that came out prior to that. So it's one of those like crazy historical, like lucky breaks, basically, where I'm like, if
Yeah,
that had happened 6 months later, like my name would not have been on this at all. Yeah.
that's so dodgy. I hate when people do stuff like that.
Yeah.
I sometimes believe in death of the author, but I'm like, you should at least know who the author is.
Yeah.
But
Credit to the author, maybe.
yeah, credit to the author. But why's my head just gone now?
You
Because
do.
I can just hear Daegu
I
screaming.
was going to say you
So
do have copious notes for
I
this.
do.
Don't you?
Yeah. So what made you decide to section the book into the way you did? So like, it's like distortion, decay, secrecy, coldness, and heresy. And I know your books. The premise is how where necessarily it's people say about not letting the fascists have black metal. Your thing is the fascists. Well, there wasn't necessarily a left wing movement to begin with, but it identifies with left wing politics, and you can use those things to your advantage, like use it as like a weapon. I think I read that somewhere. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
what made you then decide to do that, and then what made you section the book off in that way?
Um, the reason why it's like that is because I didn't really want it to be like a left-wing history of black metal. Like I feel like the history of black metal is very like well-trodden ground. Like I didn't want the book to be just a kind of left-wing version of like Lords of Chaos, for example. Um, but yeah, so I wrote the book very quickly, and I did that by starting with like the concepts, and like I laid it out the way it is because I wanted to start with the concepts that I think are specifically pretty unique to black metal. Um, and I wanted to sort of for really focusing on those to make that distinction between black metal and death metal. Which is why you see stuff like coldness or secrecy or heresy, like, and I often do make that comparison, being like, okay, death metal does have distortion, for example, but black metal makes an emphasis on being far rawer, and like death metals, especially technical death metals, emphasis on like technicality and composition, it kind of works against distortion, whereas black metal it works for it. Um, so yeah, I focus on those kind of five conventions or tendencies or whatever you'd call them, because those are the things that I think make black metal unique. And like, I don't mean to say that that's it. They were just ones that I found useful when I was kind of like from the outset when I was writing the book.
No, that
Yeah.
definitely like kind of epitomizes the sound. Like,
Well, when it comes to like distortion as well, a lot of the time the actual guitar tones in death metal are so much more tight. Whereas like when you've listened to black metal, especially with like a lot of trem picking, it's just like walls of
mm,
sound.
lots and
Yeah.
lots of reverb, a nice treble spike, scoop the med.
Yeah.
Like I'm not a like a music theory person in the slightest. Like I do know a little bit, but it's I like to think that I sort of got by without that. And what's funny about the distortion thing about how the notes aren't particularly clear is that in black metal, like you almost like it doesn't really matter. I kind of talk about this in the coldness chapter, but you play tremolo notes fast enough and with enough distortion and like reverb and that sort of thing, and it kind of just starts to sound like one note. And like going back to that Gelassenheit example, when I was speaking to her, I didn't know that she actually used a keyboard and like a synthesizer to play all her notes. Like there's no guitar in her music, but you wouldn't know that to listen to it because you chuck enough distortion on it and it just kind of sounds like an incredibly fucked up, distorted guitar.
I mean, we really
Yeah.
recently interviewed Feminazgul and had our minds blown when we found out that there's no guitar in that but
Yeah.
Feminazgul full
Yeah,
length.
Margaret Killjoy said that it's all like
It's
all the
MIDI
guitars are
instruments.
written
Yeah,
on MIDI instruments.
which is like insane to me because like you wouldn't guess, but like that's what you mean. It's buried under layers of like, that saturated lo-fi mix. And I think with black metal, I always liken it to a form of musical Stockholm syndrome, in the sense that you initially have a very visceral reaction when hearing it, and then your ear attunes to it, and then buried in this like cold, like lo-fi mix, you start to distinguish melodies and things there that it almost, because it forces you to become to concentrate so much on it, you get lost in it, and it adds to that hypnotic kind of that hypnotic essence that black metal has. It's very difficult, like trying to articulate music, like verbally, like it's, but yeah.
No, I totally agree. Like, and you kind of get that reaction. Like whenever I show my partner black metal, like the rare occasions that I do, she's like, I do not understand any of
Yeah.
this. Like, it's incomprehensible. And when I was first getting into black metal, I would play it on my speakers at home. Um, and my mother always made the joke that it sounds like a washing machine or like the fridge noise, just because that's like that's the equivalent that she's got. And I'm like, no, I swear, like there are riffs in here. You literally can't hear them if you're not familiar with it.
My favorite one was a guitarist that we attempted to start a band with, described black metal as sounding like, quote, a wolf in a biscuit tin. Which
That's pretty good.
yeah. He gets way too many mentions on this podcast.
He does,
Yeah.
he does, yeah. So would you say is like makes this book sort of necessary? Like, I know there's the climate in terms of like, it's now Ted. Fenris for once is trying to escape. But what obviously there's the rise of like the RBM scene. So what sort of, it's completely ruined my train of thought. Well, yeah. Why is the book needed?
Do you want to start again and I'll edit this out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll start this bit again. It's the first time we've done Hammering in the Basement and he's actually derailed me.
You should be prepared.
I should be prepared.
We can start again.
Right, yeah. I'll start again. So with the rise of like fascism, is this book necessary, do you think, in helping fight off the wave of like NSBM and like, I know there's things like Black Metal Rainbows as well. So like, what are these books doing that can sort of like help to like educate people?
Yeah. I mean, I like to think that the books are necessary.
I wasn't be saying they weren't. I think they are necessary.
No, that's okay.
Enjoy them.
I'm very excited by the concept.
Yeah.
No, I think uh they're sort of necessary in pointing out that like black metal, it's I I do mention this in the introduction. I try not to focus on terms like reclaiming black metal or something like that, because the implication there is that like black metal has some like left-wing core in it or something. It's like inherently left-wing, which I disagree with. But I also disagree that it's inherently right-wing, right? Like a lot of the people who helped start the genre are, but really the point that I'm staking out with the book is that black metal can be used for left-wing purposes and right-wing purposes and probably apolitical purposes. But I'm coming to it from a left-wing background. I'm going to use it for left-wing purposes. And I'm going to kind of leave the fascists to do not what they want, but kind of, it's a like fight over it, basically.
I think.
And
Oh, sorry.
no,
I
no,
think,
no, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I think like whether right or left wing, I think black metal at this stage, radical politics are an inherent part of black metal.
Hmm.
Just as a kind
Okay.
of like I think it is for better or worse, it is a venue that that incredibly like sort of like disparate radical views from different ends of the political spectrum kind of.
Yeah,
It's
but
it's something of this.
I'm not as sure though, because like we went
Mm.
that gig last night. There's people with like a Destroy 666 patch underneath a bolt throw patch, and like Carl Willits would batter KK Warsler. He would annihilate him.
Yes,
Can't
There's
say.
like
rightfully so.
Well, we had Carl Willits on the podcast the other day. The episode hasn't gone out yet, but
well, by the time this goes out, it will have gone out.
yes, and he talked explicitly about beating up Nazis in his youth.
And this is not me saying that Carl Willits is going to fight KK Warsler. This is me just saying like ideologically they don't get on. In who would win in a fight, I don't know.
You've manifested it now.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen.
Maybe. Disclaimer.
Well,
I
I'm
am
not-
not saying they want just
I don't
ideologically.
think.
This is gonna get picked up as clickbait now.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, okay, like black metal seems pretty unique in that a lot of the genre is associated with politics, and that like the members of bands are very outspokenly like political on the far left or the far right. But yeah, like you said, Danny, I'm not sure like the politics are like inherent to it. Like you can kind of listen to the music and like without really focusing on the politics if you're not that interested in like the internet side of things. Like when I started listening to black metal, like a lot of the bands that I quite liked, I had no idea what their politics are, right?
Mm.
So I really liked Drudka and I really liked Pest Noir, for example, and Burzum and all that stuff. And it was only really later on that you find out that, yeah, these people hold fucking reprehensible beliefs that, that should be a thing that you care about. If you're like a particularly political person, or if you go out of your way to kind of focus on the personalities of the bands the personalities of the people behind the bands you like. But I think there is a connection with like the kind of radical politics of it, because like you said before, Rob, like black metal kind of it often forces like a certain level of commitment from people, like and like a commitment even to just get into the genre. And I think that might help explain why black metal's politics are the way they are, is because like you have to kind of be committed one way or the other, and like the political commitment can either come secondary or as part of the music from the start, but it's always there.
So my point about the kind of like black metal having an inherent political nature was less so about the individual fan, like you were pointing out,
Yeah.
the dude with the battle jacket and whatnot, more to do from like the artist and things like that. Like it's a kind of thing of like this space has already been, kind of like tainted is definitely a wrong word and a loaded one, but like definitely like it's definitely like kind of been marked as a place where individuals such as I don't know, kind of
I understand that.
Yeah,
But like the
sorry.
people, like a lot of the people in black metal have already been quite open about their politics. So like you kind of
Yes.
start from that point.
Yeah, sorry, I'm running off very little sleep.
I think there's a thing as well where there's either bands that are extremely right wing, like like the NSBM bands that are very explicit, or there's like the left wing bands like the REBM bands that are literally explicit. But then you've got like the few who are like they're like sketchy, they're dodgy,
but they'll hide behind the label
they hide
apolitical, and when
Yeah.
but they only ever seem to complain about politics in music when it's a band from a left-wing point of view or an anti-fascist point of view. That's when it becomes an issue that people are bringing politics into black metal.
Even they might
not fucking Burzum or something like that.
They might not even necessarily be like full on Nazis, but they're happy playing with Nazis. And then when you point that out, that this person's like got like a swastika tattoo on their head or something, I don't know. There probably isn't an SBM band member with a swastika on their forehead, but you know what I mean?
There's gotta be one.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. Yeah, it's a very
Yeah.
it's a very strange genre as well. And I feel like I don't have to vet other bands as much as I do when it comes to black metal. It's a very
Yeah. Like I
yeah.
think there was a if I remember correctly, there was a TikTok video that kind of went like popped off on Twitter maybe a couple weeks ago. Like I think it was a if I remember correctly, I think it was a black guy talking about how he just does not want to get into black metal as a genre, like because of the Nazi association.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
No.
And I think, yeah, I think that's totally fair. Like I don't blame anyone for wanting to stay out. But I guess what I hope the book does, and what I hope like Black Metal Rainbows does, is it kind of brings up that like the black metal is more than just an unequivocally like Nazi adjacent genre.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like I do like the idea of where it's like it's not necessarily like reclaiming, it's just sort of like you
Recontextualizing,
yeah,
perhaps.
recontextualizing, yeah.
Yeah,
And then also
I agree.
not not letting the fascists have any ground. Because it's like I don't really know what it's like in Australia, but the UK is like horrible at the
Yeah,
moment. But I do know that um a certain turf went all the way around Australia and New Zealand recently and got absolutely destroyed when she went over there.
yeah.
So that gave me hope. But then there were
Well, not
also
really. Like
neo-Nazis.
in Australia, unfortunately, she had quite a bit of support, and like I think it was particularly the rally in Melbourne that got quite famous because that was like there were a lot of photos of like her speaking and then like a line of Nazis in balaclavas like
Yeah,
essentially like protecting her group and like yeah like she did I mean she got made fun of but like New Zealand honestly did a much better job of countering her with eggs and various other things
yeah.
than Australia did.
I
Yeah,
just
which
found it
really like people how do I put it? Like they sort of misunderestimate, I think, the Nazi element in Australia. Like, because we like to assume that Australia, I mean, at least people in Australia are sort of beyond politics. It's a very like kind of comfortable social democracy, I guess, or like that's the way it's popularly understood.
I mean,
But I think events like this really bring up that like there is a really big far right problem
yeah.
here.
yeah. The thing I found with the neo-Nazis there though is they just looked like the type of guys that go on nights out here. I was like, they looked really normal. Whereas neo-Nazis in this country are like they look like freaks. Whereas these guys look
Yeah.
normal. And I was like, what? But it's kind of scary because I'm like, these look like normal people.
Well, I think
Like
like
Nazi punk kind of started in the UK, right? So the
Yeah,
sort of like
yeah,
the skinhead association started there. Whereas in Australia, like it's in a lot of like bodybuilding communities, and I guess they're more interested in like appealing to normal or like normal people, I
yeah.
guess.
I just thought it was strange about the Melbourne thing where all the TERFs were like, no, the Nazis were here to counter our protests, and then the guy literally goes, no, we were here to help her.
Mm,
It's
it's
like,
like
yeah.
guys saying the quiet part loud.
yeah.
But no, I mean like
Yeah, you go ahead.
I don't know, I was going to ask like more generally like what the political climate is like in Australia because I know that you've got that shit woman that recently, well, not recently, a couple of years ago, like came into the Australian Parliament in a burqa to
Oh,
try
I
and
remember reading about that. Yeah,
yeah, like I know that she seems almost like some kind of like Nigel Farage-esque figure. And like
Yes.
from my under like my understanding of like the political climate in that part of the world, I think that like Australia is a fair bit more conservative, generally speaking, than New Zealand. I might have that totally off, but
That's correct.
okay.
Um, I think Australia, yeah, it's very funny. So there's a term in Australia called like the lucky country,
Mm,
um, which initially started out by an Australian author as a point of criticism, basically saying that Australia has this conception of itself as being like lucky in that white Australians anyway had a bunch of essentially free land like handed to them from the British Empire. And like a relatively stable social democracy through the 20th century, and relatively untouched by things like invasion, except from like the project of colonialism, of course. Um, but since then, the lucky country has kind of been a term that a lot of Australians have adopted in like a positive way, but I think it sort of makes us a bit too comfortable. So, like Australia, there's often this assumption that like it's a classless society, um, and that like you had very rich people mingling with very poor people, whatever. It's very like fake kumbaya sort of, except for
Mm.
like white, like middle class people. Um, and it is, and I think that's sort of allowed a fairly conservative undercurrent to really take hold. Like Australia has always had a lot of problems with racism,
Mm.
because effectively Australia is fucking part of Asia, right? Continents are like made up, but like they're like Oceania is basically Asia, but Australia and New Zealand are white people, so we don't want to call Australia part of Asia. Um, and so like that's manifested in like a fair amount of like anti-Asian racism, for basically as long as Australia has been a country.
Do you
Yeah.
think it's possibly a result, and like this is just like literally just like me hypothesizing, like on the spot, but like I know that New Zealand, they seem to have embraced sort of like Maori culture a lot more, like kind of reconciled their colonial past a lot more than Australia possibly, and maybe that's because it was, obviously in Australia, like indigenous people were literally like, hunted almost for sport because they were considered like flora and fauna, and it was just
Yeah.
generally. Do you think it might, what you were describing might be a result of like the failure to kind of deal with the colonial past in the way that maybe like other countries have?
I think
Not to
so.
say that
I
New
do.
Zealand, not to say that New Zealand's like perfect. It's just I know that they are a lot more celebratory of like sort of Maori and indigenous culture there.
Yeah. Um, I think so, honestly. And I think like in part, um, it's a lot easier to teach Maori culture, I suppose, because there's like in general, it's considered that there is one kind of more unified Maori culture in New Zealand.
Hmm.
Whereas in Australia, there are literally like hundreds of different language groups. That's not the beginning of it, obviously, but I think it does make that process a little easier. Like I don't want to let Australia off the hook
Yeah.
for any of this, of course. Um, I think in general, like Australia has failed to recognize that in a lot of ways, and even like a lot of just language differences, I suppose. Like I mean, but like I've said, like you couldn't really like there's a big movement to refer to New Zealand as Aotearoa, which is like the Maori term for the country, and I think that's good.
Yeah.
But you could not do that with Australia, just because like it's such a massive country, but also like there's so many different language groups that even a movement towards that would basically be impossible. But like obviously there are things you could do. Like in New Zealand, they teach Maori in I think every secondary school. I'm not sure.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
not sure what the yeah, in Australia, like you could teach the local indigenous languages if they're even still around. Um, yeah, but I think as I was saying, in Australia, like it's fairly socially conservative with like a fairly comfortable social democracy over the top of it. But that social democracy will not be there forever.
Hmm.
That we didn't really have to fight to. Well, Australia used to have quite a good labor movement, but
Mm.
actually the Labour Party in Australia are really the ones that fuck that over. But that's a much longer
Oh,
That
conversation for
sounds
another day.
it
familiar.
sounds familiar. Also, there's
Yeah.
maybe
Oh, anyway,
a
yeah.
certain, uh, to quote Rob, testicle with bifocals. Rupert Murdoch have anything to do with that?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
He does look like a
He
testicle
does.
with
He does look like testicles with
bifocals.
bifocals. I I'm surprised that he's getting married again because at this
Very
point
clearly for love, and I'm sure that they're going to be very happy together.
Of course, hey, you can find love at any age, right?
Yeah,
Um,
even 305.
especially with a bank account as big as his.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, like trying to kind of circle this back to black metal.
Yes.
We that's okay.
Promise to be
Like a lot
digression.
of yeah, it was funny to realize that like a lot of the black metal bands that I listened to, a lot of the Australian black metal bands I listened to as a younger person, like teenager and like kind of early 20s, I guess. Um, they were actually like almost all of them were Nazis. Like, and they don't really make that obvious. Like, there's a I refer to it in the Black Circles chapter. It's Ordo Ata Angui, I think. It means like Order of the Black Serpent in Latin or something like that. But you look at the bands there and you look at the label that they're on, and it's almost all like Nazi adjacent. So like Drowning the Light is the big one, I suppose. Um, Nazul, I think, is another one. I think that's spelt Nazxul.
Wait,
But
is
like
that the
as a
band
kid,
that Steve Hughes, the because we've got a metalhead comedian in that's quite big in the UK called Steve Hughes.
yeah.
I think he used to be the drummer for Nazul, and I know that he like goes off against like political.
Okay.
I know that he like complains about political correctness an awful lot, like in his as part of his act, but I wasn't aware that he was like Nazi adjacent, which is
Oh no, I
concerning.
mean I hope I'm getting the band wrong if that's the case. Like is it an Australian band, if you're aware, or
Oh, I mean, he's an Australian metalhead that's kind of came over and relocated to the UK and now has like a prominent like comedy career.
okay, well I fuck it might be, I'm not sure. But I know like
Sure.
Drowning the Light is the big one off the top of my head, and there were a couple of guys like and they're never open about their politics, right? It's the same thing as
Yeah.
Drudka for the most part. Like they don't mention politics at any point. Um they just sort of let that be like implicit part of their music that you do have to pay a little bit of attention to in order to find. But like, I discovered that relatively recently. Like I hadn't listened to them for a few years at least. And then in the process of writing the book, I kind of like, oh, let's look at this. Let's look at who's in this band. And you kind of look at like the associated acts thing in Metal
Mhm.
Archives, and you're like, oh, that's none of that's a good sign.
I've got a friend from like in Australia who plays in several black metal bands, so I've kind of been like I've like had his like list of the various bands he's played in open just in case I'm like, oh no, am I gonna have to cut ties with this guy? Thankfully, it appears not, but
Well,
Yeah, it's that's difficult. And I refer to an Australian black metal band like in the introduction of the book. And going back to what we were talking about earlier with that kind of disavowing politics mentality of it, like this Australian band, Spear of Longinus, um, literally like every one of their albums and every one of their demos like references Nazism in one way or another, right? Like I think I think they've got like literally a CD that's just called like Esoteric National Socialism or something
oh
like that.
Jesus.
Um, but they have, in all of their publications or in all of their public like press stuff, they say, oh no, we have nothing to do with politics. I'm like, what do you mean you have nothing to do with politics?
it's like Marduk do the same thing, don't they? Marduk
Oh,
and then
theirs is even weirder.
Yeah.
Like, because you like obviously like there were like Norwegian SS divisions and whatnot, and the guy from Marduk's grandfather was in the fucking SS, and he's like, "Oh well, it's not about politics. It's just about celebrating my grandfather's war career or something." It's like
Yeah.
in
When
the
that war career
SS,
is specifically,
like not
yeah.
even just like in the Wehrmacht, the fucking SS, like. Yeah.
So that's funny. Okay, I've just done some looking up, and yes, that the band Nazul, they are the ones that Steve Hughes was the drummer of, and they are the ones associated with this kind of like Australian Nazi adjacent black
wow.
circle
Ah,
in
That's
Australia. Yeah.
that's really depressing because I've paid money to
It
see them
is,
live on
yeah.
the
You
occasion.
funded a Nazi and you should be bad. Oh, Nazi adjacent.
Am I cancelled? No.
I just don't want to
Okay.
start beef now. It's like calling him a Nazi and now saying that Carl Woods is going to fight KK
Can
Warsler.
you stop saying
I've
KK Warslep's name on the podcast?
I just think I can't take him seriously. Whenever KK Warslett is brought up, it's like
Stop bringing him up.
his name, KK Warslett.
Well,
It's like,
it is funny because there was kind of a minor controversy about them I think it was last year or 2021. But they had a few gigs cancelled in Australia, like because of that association. I think they were playing with Bolzer. And people brought up, KK Warslut's like a dickhead. And I think it's the singer or the guitarist for Bolzer who's like doing this weird thing of trying to like reclaim the swastika,
oh
but
yeah,
on
I
an
heard about that. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, on an aesthetic level, like he literally just has tattoos of different kinds of swastikas. Like I'm not sure you're doing what you think you're doing, I suppose.
I think there's a difference if it's some like obviously it's like as a white person, your association, a white person from the West as well, your association with a swastika isn't going to be the same as its original meanings. It's just not.
I mean,
And I wouldn't
it's
say it's
such a
your place
simple
to try and.
it's such a simple like geometric pattern that it's existed pretty much in every culture, like including like Anglo-Saxon culture. And because I when I did stuff like that Anglo-Saxon reenactment group, my friend warned me, like he was like, by the way, you're going to see a lot of swastikas. These guys are all like either LGBT or allies, or they're very much on the left. It's just the fact that they're trying to honestly portray history, and that iconography was used by like 6th century Germanic peoples.
Wow.
But
See, I didn't know
That's
that.
interesting.
it's
No,
because
me
it's like
neither. Like,
it's especially with like tablet weaving, and when you're doing like textiles and things like that, you can only really like branch off on straight lines. So it kind of it's quite an easy pattern to make, especially in like textiles and things like that.
So Nazis are basic, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
repurpose something that's more complicated, surely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads on as well, because when we asked you to pick some songs that are relevant and then books, you picked the Decibel Omega songs. It's relevant to what you talk about in your book, and I was like, I don't want to play that on the radio, because that was the thing where it must have been 2019, the album that came out there. I really liked that album, and then I remember it got to like the end of the year. I was watching Banger TV in their roundup, and Blaine was like, I'm not playing that because the guy from Decibel Omega is a Nazi and has like a weird side project, which is a bit, well, I don't know the
Yes.
details, but it's
A bit noncy.
bit noncy, we'll say a bit noncy. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, fuck's sake, went to Spotify and unliked the album. But yeah, it's weird how like left-wing bands are never ashamed to say what they believe in, whereas a lot of the time,
Whereas it's like a game of peekaboo with Nazis.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like the Dawn Raid
Well,
song
and I'm sorry, you go ahead, Dan.
was in Wildfire when they say they don't sing about anything that they wouldn't.
There's nothing in these songs of which to be ashamed.
Yeah.
All of these things that we sing about are just as plainly so.
Yeah. Whereas then Nazis are like, here's a song about swastikas, public statement. We are apolitical.
And like I've said this on another podcast as well, but like I suppose like in a way you can consider that a good thing because like they are pretending to be apolitical for the sake of like money event like at the end of the day. Like and it is good that being a Nazi is not commercially viable. um uh, but yeah, I mean, I think there are left-wing bands that don't really talk about it. Like, for example, like I think the guys from Wolves in the Throne Room, they've like, if I remember correctly, they've played in like squats and stuff, and they're open about the whole like anarcho-primitivist and like nature worship thing, but they're not really open about the like the anarchist part. They really focus on the primitivist part, let's say. So sorry,
Yeah.
Rob, you go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Yeah, like you're like absolutely bang on with like Wolves in the Throne Room and stuff like that. And I know that they were like a big entry for other bands like Dawn Raid and like some other anarchist bands that like came after them. It was
Mm.
bit of a change of topic, but it was something I was meaning to ask before when we were talking about the structure of your book, and it suddenly just came back into my mind. Talking about like heresy is one of the component things within black metal. Is that like why you feel that it's kind of like a space for these politics as well? Because you know that questioning of authority and kind of like and of dogma. Do you feel like, well, that's kind of where you're coming from that
I th-
angle?
yeah, I do. And I think like Antidogma is like and willing to take that as far as it can go, I guess. Like, and I might be too much like I'm not a traditional Marxist by any stretch, but like Marx was very much like an anti-dogmatist, and that includes
Yes.
like not like anti-utopian socialism as well, and this idea that like you've got the perfect image of the future or whatever, and like Marx is absolutely against that.
Well, I think
And
he
rightly
said
so.
that even he could not give a definition of communism. He was like, we cannot know and define communism until we see it, you know, like until it like
Yeah.
manifests. And I think it might have been in relation to the Paris Commune that he said, and it often gets misconstrued by right wingers to be like, haha, see, even Marx disavowed his entire life's work, but it wasn't. It was when he said, all I know is that I am not a Marxist, by seeing what other Marxists who have taken him very, very
Mm,
literally had done with his texts, even you know, before his death, and then obviously that would then be taken to a much greater degree with more tragedy, as you see, like you know, the evolution of like you know Stalinism and whatnot that would follow. But
yeah,
yeah,
of
sorry,
course.
that was a very elaborate way of me saying I agree with you that Marx was not a dogmatist. Sorry.
Yeah. And like I think that's the and I think in part that's why like anarchism is seemingly more popular among black metal than more traditional kinds of Marxism. Um, it's because like in part I think a lot of music is like a lot of musical culture might you could say is like libertarian in nature, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think particularly it is that kind of anti-dogmatism and that like unwillingness to be attached to any authoritative structure, I guess, whether that's capitalism or the state or religion or anything
Hmm.
like that. And towards the end of the book, that's why I sort of stake out the difference between like the right wingers' idea of heresy, because they're totally willing to take this idea of like, oh, we should be anti-religious, and they always make a point of focusing on Islam when they talk about
Yeah,
anti-religion.
Of course.
Um, yeah, and they say, okay, we should definitely be anti-religious and we should be anti-state sometimes if they're like that weird kind of anarcho-fascist hybrid. Um, but at the end of the day, there are certain points of view that they are willing to take as like uncontestable, stuff like the family or traditional values or whatever they think those are. Whereas I think it's only the left that's willing to, what's Marx's quote? Like abolish the present state of things, I think, and take that as far as yeah they can.
yeah. I find it funny with when it comes back to the atheist thing because a lot of like the sort of atheists from a few years ago, they've all shifted to the right. Like Richard Dawkins, yeah, they rode the whole like 9/11 thing with Islam, and then it like gets to the
I
point
think
where
it
it's
was
like,
specifically Christopher Hitchens that kind of like
yeah,
9/11, like because prior to that, like wasn't he a Trotskyist?
I think so.
Like before
Yeah.
that, like it was just
Yes.
so bizarre.
But with Richard Dawkins, he's literally gone full turf now as well, like just posting shite all the time on Twitter, and it's like shit that makes no sense as well. And then they espouse these things of like critical thinking, and they fail the most basic concepts of critical thinking.
Mm. And Richard Dawkins has kind of argued for like, if I remember correctly, he's argued for Christianity, but like specifically as a bulwark against like Islam in Europe. So he's
Yeah,
trying to do this whole like clash of civilizations thing.
I think they're just grifters.
and
I think it's like,
it's how I feel. Like, I think Jordan Peterson does something very similar with his attempt to foisting Christianity on the young and being like, talking about it as like a moral structure. And what frustrates me specifically with Peterson is that I know people who have been influenced by his like psychology of Christianity, like that kind of like whole video series that he did, whereas it's not. Those are things that are not inherent to the Bible. Those are things that after we've developed these systems of thought, 2,000 years later, we're retrofitting onto these like 3,000 year old fables. And it's kind of a thing of like, no, this like weird like postmodern, which irony that like that get associated with Peterson, but like it is. It's just frustrating and weird when you're seeing people that like, otherwise are very intelligent people that get taken in by that, because it's like he gives it this like academic veneer that makes it okay to kind of swallow absurdities, I suppose. Sorry, that was a bit of a
Very long, and also I don't think Jordan Peterson could say that without crying.
He can't say a lot with it.
He can't, no.
No, but it is the kind of thing of like he's over intellectualized certain things to the point where it gives some kind of level of credibility to.
I don't understand how you can say this phrase postmodern Marxism without
when it's a
realizing
contradiction
they're
in terms.
contradictory terms. It's like, hey Jordan.
Without really mentioning any people who could genuinely be like referred to as postmodern Marxist. Like, I mean, I'm a big fan of Deleuze and Guattari, for example, like, or like if like or Leclerc and Moth or something. Like, those are thinkers who you could almost call like postmodern Marxists, but it's a lot easier. Like, I've made this joke before, but I think it's a lot easier to pretend to have read Foucault than it is to pretend to have read Deleuze and Guattari. So I think that's where, yeah, that's why his focus is on Foucault specifically, and because you can focus on like the very boring, like moral, you can call Foucault a degenerate, basically, is the thing.
Yeah,
Like, those aren't words I would use, but those are the words that he would use, certainly.
Didn't Chomsky call him a degenerate?
I never watched the Chomsky Foucault debate, but I know that they had like serious beef in like the 80s or 90s.
Yeah.
And
I like Foucault though. He looks cool. I don't know why.
It's the leather coat.
Aerodynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he wrote the Panopticon as well, which again goes back around to Panopticon the band. So
Like, and that's the thing. I think Panopticon, like the band, of mostly or Austin, I guess, because he's the only person in Panopticon, have mostly left the political nature of it behind, as far as I understand. Like, it's become a lot more about the kind of nature stuff that you could expect from Cascadian black metal, I suppose. Like his earlier albums, particularly, like Social Disservices is one, and that's specifically about like the foster system, as far as I'm like, if I'm remembering that correctly. And then there's Kentucky, which is fantastic, of
I
course.
mean, like, is it on Kentucky where he has like his own renditions of like old kind of like miners like work song, like like as in like sort
Yeah.
of union work songs and things like that, and like it's he was like wearing his politics kind of more brazenly kind of in earlier albums. You're right, but I think
I think you could. I think you could almost say that's like a progenitor of like Dawn Raid's new album. There's Dawn Raid's new album. I really like there are just songs where there's a lot of like chanting and stuff. It almost does remind me of those like older like Union songs, I
yeah,
suppose.
I felt that like that album was like really interesting, especially like songs like Freedom in Retrograde and things like that. Like it felt like it was borrowing more from like the English folk tradition. And I know that you didn't like those elements of that album, but
it's
I
not I didn't like
really
them. I just think that
dug it.
my opinion of the new album was Battle of the Sudden Flame, Go Three Companions, like all the singles they released are like the best songs they've ever written. I just think maybe the break in the middle with like the a cappella folk stuff, to me, just like I didn't not like it. I just felt like maybe things could have been like jumbled around a bit. And then I also thought maybe Wildfire could have been taken out and another song put in, like a new song, but that might have been me just being greedy.
No, yeah, I disagree and think that I really like that kind of like break in the middle that kind of gives you a moment to catch your breath and almost like kind of actually absorb the message of what they're trying to say on the album because it's being presented in that kind of more palatable folk kind of way with like clean singing and stuff like that. I personally think it works, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, we saw them
I'm
a few weeks. Sorry, we saw them a few weeks ago, and they did the whole album in full, and that was it. Well, they didn't do that.
It wasn't the full
Yeah,
album, but it was the entire
most of
set.
it.
The entire set was songs off the new
But
album.
it was in order. It was like
Yeah.
the a cappella folk song was in it.
okay.
So maybe that's why when I listened to it, I just because it was the day before it got released, we just heard the full set, which was like the album front to back pretty much, and then
All the heavy songs off the
yeah,
album
all the
anyway.
heavy songs, and then it was like that sort of took me out. Maybe that might be what it is. Don't know. Also, one
Do you
thing I
think
noticed
that
was
I was going to say, do you think that there's a possibility that like you said, Rob, I think they're trying to draw from that old English like folk tradition. Do you think that there's a possibility that they're sort of connecting that with like left-wing politics to kind of redress the balance of like a few English black metal bands who really focus on like English folk heritage kind of stuff that
It's
are like using it as a cover for right-wing politics? I don't know much about like the English folk tradition, so you might have a better insight there than me.
so it's quite like I think it's quite possible that that's what they're attempting to do. And we had Simon, the vocalist, on the podcast. Like I think it was our first episode. Well, it was our first episode, and he was very big on that kind of reclamation of culture and realizing that kind of like it's not just fascists and reactionaries that can be proud of where they come from and stuff like that. Yes, you
Hmm.
have to acknowledge the shittier parts of your history, but especially when it comes to like literature and culture, like of course you can be proud of it and still hold, progressive if not radical views. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that kind of using like the English folk tradition in the way that they did, I think, like as you said, I think was intentional. Um, yeah. So sorry, I'm as I said, I'm a bit sleep deprived. So if I'm not as coherent as normal, I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. Me too. Like I've said. I guess that was partly my attitude towards like black metal for the book in general. That like, as you said, I do draw on Deathspell Omega and I think Marduk in a chapter or two, even though like I obviously mentioned that these bands are associated with like right-wing politics in black metal and in general. Um, I guess I don't want to say my excuse, I guess, but I like to say like my reasoning of it is I kind of like to use like even if I'm using these bands against themselves in a way that like traditionally like a lot of left-wing thinkers have drawn on people from like Nietzsche or Heidegger or Carl Schmitt or something like that. And like Nietzsche wasn't a Nazi because he wasn't around for that. But
Yeah.
he did have reactionary politics personally. But I think it's more of a question, like one, of acknowledging that, but also it's a question of like what you do with those beliefs, I guess. So I don't make any excuses for Deathspell Omega or Miko Aspa or anything like that. Um, it's just yeah, I mean using their thought amongst other things.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Sadly, like those elements exist, and like you can go like I don't know, you sort of mentioned Nietzsche there, but it's like kind of I think it's completely possible, especially with sort of like with music and things that hit you on like an emotional level, like even in like Nietzsche's time, like sort of like people like Wagner, if I'm remembering rightly, he had a massive falling out with Wagner of the whole anti-Semitism thing, or
Mm,
I could be wrong. So it's a kind of thing of like, yeah, I think you can still like I know that we come down on different sides of it, but I think you can definitely still draw on those bands and stuff like that whilst acknowledging the shitty sides of them. But yeah, it's kind of
yeah,
death of
I
the
think it's
author-esque
yeah, I
kind of
think it's
argument.
contextual. I think it also annoys me when people like in like left-wing black metal spaces, they'll just go, "Oh, this band's a Nazi, so they're crap," and it's like
I wish that was always
yeah,
the
I wish it was
case.
like as I said, like I really enjoyed that Deathspell Omega album. I didn't know who they were, and then when I found
Yeah.
out, I was like, oh, for fuck's sake! And it happens a lot, but like, you know, you can like, you can separate them to a degree, but like yeah, you can like listen to Emperor, like I do now, but there's certain things where I'm like, I don't know, I just can't.
Yeah, no, I get
Yeah,
that.
everybody's got their lines in a different place.
Yeah,
Like there's,
I'm
isn't
not going to judge people for it either. It's if it's like your level of comfortability, and it's just like with me personally, I'm just like, I don't know. I don't even listen to Burzum anymore. I can play like EA Lord of the Depths on guitar every now and then because it's a fun riff to play.
Mhm.
But then I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I can find enough alternatives where I don't need it.
well,
So
like
it's
Wolves
like,
in the Throne Room cite Burzum as a direct influence and stuff like that, and you know, there are bands that draw heavily on that that don't have the problematic politics, and to some extent, you can
yeah.
still enjoy some
Yeah.
of the
I think
adjacent.
that's a product of culture in general. Like how many hip hop artists have like drawn in from like inspiration from Kanye, and now he's turned out to be an absolute freak of nature. Like
Yeah.
so,
Like I think almost like I mean the conventions that we associate with black metal mostly just came from Burzum and Darkthrone more than anything else. And so I think like almost all of black metal, like it does have some influence in Burzum inherently, whether it's just like the kind of ethos, how they approach production. Um, so it's yeah, it like obviously you have to acknowledge that, and like whether or not you want to go out of your way and say no, Varg's a dickhead or whatever. Like I think um we should just be very clear that like I can like conservatives can make some good music. That's why that's often why people start listening to black metal as I did, right? Like you get into some bands and accidentally discover later on that they have horrible politics. Um,
My
you know,
introduction was
and
bizarre though. Like I watched Until the Light Takes Us as my like almost like
mm,
one of my original introductions to black metal. And it was the fact that, you know, so I got the whole story and found out about all like the reprehensible things that they did, but there was something that made me keep repeat watching that documentary because it was something to do with that the atmosphere of the film as a whole, like and the sound effect, the soundtrack as part of that, but it was also like kind of it had that cold, gritty feeling just with the
and
documentary.
that weird memeable bit where Frost is on the plane and the kids looking at him like, "What the hell are you?"
There's a number of memeable bits from that film.
yeah, I think it is interesting. Yeah, black metal has like a more all-encompassing hostility, and like I said before, there is like a total commitment to the music that you don't often get in other genres. Like, I can't remember where it is, but there's a bit in the Lords of Chaos book where where a lot of black metal people are talking about death metal and being like, no, they're lame, like they wear normal clothes, right? Like you see death metal bands, and it's like cargo shorts and like a band t-shirt
Oh yeah,
and
like
sometimes long hair, right?
yeah,
Whereas
Fenrir
like
goes
black
on about
metal,
that,
it's
and
capes, cows, whatever. Sorry, Rob.
I don't know,
Continue.
that's okay. Yeah, like Fenris goes on about that in the Until the Light Takes this documentary. Like he's saying, like, you know, like all these people that we were looking up to that like Florida death metal sound, like ended up looking like surfer dudes and stuff like that. And
Hmm.
it's like no, and it was a whole rebellion against that like overproduced Florida death metal sound and the look of it. And yeah, no, it's just again me elaborately agreeing with the point you're making.
Yeah. And like what I talk the reason I talk about that like secrecy element in black metal as well is because black metal is like pretty unique in its use of like or in its not willing to talk much about themselves for music, which I find interesting. Like I can't remember if I mentioned it in the book, but yeah, like the Metallica's Some Kind of Monster documentary is like that was like embarrassing for a reason, right? It's because you just
Yeah.
lay it all out on the table. Whereas black metal musicians, they will be asked about like themselves or their personal politics, and they just won't. respond. Like, I talk about that funny interview in I think it's in Metal a Headbanger's Journey, where Garl gets interviewed and they ask him, oh,
Say 10.
like, yeah, what is like, what are your, what does he say? It's like, what is the ideology or what is the philosophy behind Gorgoroth? And he just says Satan. And like, that's funny. And it's obviously like a contrived bit,
Mm.
but like no other genre of music could probably get away with that. Like in more popular music, you've got stuff like, Nardwar, where he like, I love Nardwar, but like
Yeah.
he will like reveal everything about a musician, like where they went to school, like their parents, like,
Sometimes,
yeah.
like, to the point where, like, you can see the musician in question getting visibly uncomfortable.
Yeah,
They're like,
I've
how the
seen
hell do you know that?
I've
Like,
seen a compilation of like a load of like rappers, and like he's going up to him and saying like, "Oh, your name, like your rap name was this," and they were like, "What the fuck? How did you know
like,
that?"
like, I went by that for like 2 shows
Yeah,
or something like
or they're
that.
like,
Like,
"I literally said that."
Yeah.
One of them was like, "I literally like said that to my friend or something," like
yeah.
once, and it's like, "Oh my god."
I want to
Like,
know
I
like,
think
what
part
his
of the
research team is like.
it must be insane. But like, I think part of the reason why like Varg is so funny, I think, in black metal is because people know so much about him, like compared to other musicians. Like, I shouldn't know that his dad, like that he grew up in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, right? But that's like a known fact about Varg, and like his mum was like involved with his was that his mum was involved with his like legal case back in the 90s and this whole thing. Like, I don't, yeah, I think that's why there is a certain mystique around people like Euronymous and around Dead, because like they died or were killed before, before they had the chance to become like actual people. They were just kind of figures in black metal.
That's actually one thing that I enjoyed about the Lords of Chaos film. That some people, mainly the people who still do this, but like because we have mythologized these figures so much in the same way you said with Dead and Euronymous, because they never
Hmm.
existed in the age of social media and stuff like that, so you don't have that much information about them. The decision to just portray them as like douchey teenagers with mental health problems was probably like,
But that's probably what it was, though.
but like, yeah, I
I would
really
put money on it
appreciate
being
that.
like that.
But the thing is, because like fans of the genre have mythologized them and made them that these almost like mythical figures, that when they're actually seeing like a human portrayal of them, they're
Yeah.
reacting with so much animosity. It's really
I
funny.
think it's as well people getting into it a lot later. Like, I started getting into black metal properly when I was like 20, and I'm now like 27. But like, we were speaking to Melissa Moore, and she was of Sonia, and she was saying like, she was like listening to this stuff as it was coming out, and was like, "Oh, here's this like band from coming like from Norway. Look how cool this sounds." And then you don't know anything about it. Whereas like now, people of our generation have got like a whole. You get into it, and you can just like doom scroll about everything to do with this thing.
Every horrible thing they've ever said in an
Yeah,
interview, or yeah.
and it just builds this mythology. Whereas there's a lot more of a level of like detachment from people, I think, who actually grew up with it and were able to detach it. And I think I kind of would want to know like the demographics of the people who were up in arms about that film, whether it's like people who knew they were just like a bunch of like dorky kids anyway, or whether it's like people who've like made black metal like a load bearing part of their personality, which I have necessarily.
Yeah.
I also like death metal.
Yeah, we have a basement podcast that we
True.
talk at length about black metal.
That is true.
Yeah, like I don't know, I think black metal made or black metal bands have gone a long way out of like not a lot of personal information, or like they've gone a long way out of that like mythology about themselves. Like, I talk about, what is it, the not the Black Twilight Circle, but the Les Legions Noir from France, like back in the 90s, I think. And they kind of styled themselves after that initial Black Circle of like Mayhem, Burzum, Emperor, Dark Throne, blah blah blah. Um, but it's like the one in France, that was literally like three guys with about 10 different bands,
Yeah.
and then they never really released anything publicly. They just gave demos to their friends and stuff. And like in the years since, you kind of do build up like a mythology about these people. Like, oh my God, what are they like? And it helps that in every promo photo, like they took on this like persona of like vampires. So it takes that as far as it can go. Like black metal is always like hamp in that way, but I definitely appreciate the commitment to that it takes to do that.
Cool.
I think camp is one of the perfect words to describe black metal. I think that's why like I do think it works, especially with like sort of like LGBT stuff as well. And I'm not surprised why there are like
Mm.
why there is like a lot of like writing people like get offended by stuff which is like, how do they not realize, like the comments in the Dawn Raid like videos, like I was really surprised by it, but I think that might have been the result of like a pile. I think it was like the Goes Free Companions videos.
I think basically what I think that was a result of was some right-wing shitlord page had basically shared it, and then all of their fans had just flocked to the videos to leave shitty comments.
But I don't know whether, because I'm in left-wing black metal groups, I've got like an echo chamber, and then I'm like, no, black metal is just really cool.
I mean, like the
And
music,
it's a few weird people out there.
I think it's kind of probably a little of column A, little of column B. I don't
Yeah.
think it's like, I think the vast majority of people are ones that just want like just genuinely passionately enjoy the music, but necessarily they're not even hiding behind the whole apolitical thing. Like I've spoken to people who've got very middle of the road, like center left leaning politics that just genuinely don't give a shit that Varg's a Nazi and like Burzum, and
Yeah.
I think that's the camp that the majority of people find themselves in.
Yeah. I think a lot of people can
Yeah.
detach themselves and go like, well, I'm not a Nazi, so
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I just think it's a little of both.
I think, yeah, I think it's one of those things where I'm very glad that I have a job that allows me to talk to normal people very often, or like non-internet people,
Yes.
because the amount of people I know in my personal life who went out of their way to like pre-order and buy that new Harry Potter game, like it's like, and I'll talk to them about it, but like at the end of the day, they do just have that belief of like, oh, like separate art from the artist, whatever. J.K. Rowling's a bitch, but whatever. This is from them, I should say. But but if you came to that from like if how do I put it? If you understood that game only from something like Twitter, you'd be like, oh my God, that game sold like 3 copies. But like, no, it was extremely popular among people who do go out of their way to separate art from the artist in that way and don't really think too much about like the personal politics of people or how that affects the stuff that they produce.
Yeah, like I don't think everybody that went out and bought the game is a raging transphobe. They just maybe
No, neither do I.
yeah. Oh yeah. No. Again, just kind of agreeing with you, but like it's just like yeah. I think it is just unfortunately a lot of people don't kind of care, and the concept of voting with your wallet or like like it just doesn't exist to them or enter in their head. It's just a thing they want.
yeah. Because I for a while was like, oh, I like that game, like the look of that game, because I did like Harry Potter as a kid, and I'm like, now I'm just like, there's no point in me even getting it secondhand or playing it. And then it's like the HBO stuff as well now. It's just garbage. I don't like J.K. Rowling.
Yeah,
To go back to sorry, to go back to what you said before about like black metal having this connection to like gay culture and stuff is quite interesting because quite early on in the Black Metal Rainbows book, the authors basically say that. They say like, oh, like right wingers will often argue that, oh, or people who are anti-black metal in general might say that like, oh, black metal is like gay or whatever, is a derogatory term, but they openly say like we're embracing it for that purpose. Like the elaborate costuming and the creation of like different identities and stuff. Like I do definitely understand why why there has been a quite big movement towards that, and quite like an embrace of black metal by a lot of trans women, I think.
I've like never actually thought of like Count Grishnak being Varg's drag persona up until this moment.
It makes sense.
Yeah, but that like just it was just a switch went in my head then and was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
I hope he sees this.
You've had internet beef with Varg
Oh,
before.
I've got into an actual argument with Varg.
Really?
It was about Tolkien lore.
Oh God. Okay.
So it was back when Varg actually had a YouTube channel, and it was in his comment section, and he released this vague, rambling political video about how the state of modern politics is, of course, exactly like the Lord of the Rings, with very little nuance. And saying how like Obama is Saruman and Putin is Sauron, and but actually conspiring together, blah blah blah. And I was like, I think this is absurd, but also here are all the things you actually got wrong about the law, and it just really triggered him, and it ended up being like a several thing long thread, and yeah.
Sounds like an absolute nightmare. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know. Like I am quite glad that I think Varg is banned on Twitter now, because otherwise I would probably get into it with him on there, which is a much I think that's a much less productive avenue for
um,
discussion.
I think he's only very recently been banned, because I know he's banned on YouTube, but the last thing I saw from Varg, and it was so entertaining, was himself and a Christian neo-Nazi having a go at each other and like going back and forth, calling each other all of these horrible names because one's a monotheist and one's a polytheist, and it's just like
Jesus.
it's just like get the popcorn. It was
Well, because we've got the HornThrowers Twitter now, but I've always avoided it throughout my life. And then now I'm like, please
scroll.
Yeah, I'm like, I must not comment from the HornThrowers account and argue with this transphobe or something, or just like just dunk on this absolute moron.
I
And
mean,
it's
I
like,
don't care if you do.
you don't care, but then I'm like, I want to keep it at least professional. Otherwise, I will just argue for ages, and it will consume my life. It will just be that.
Yeah, should we get into your 5 picks for the radio?
Yeah, I was gonna say
Okay,
we
absolutely.
have derailed. We've derailed completely.
Yeah,
We've covered good ground, I think.
yeah, it's the podcast's always a little bit chaotic and freeform, but we kind of embrace that chaos. But yeah, should we get?
Absolutely. Hang on a second. I have forgotten what I actually chose because I think it was a couple weeks ago.
Do you
I've
have the
got
list?
them here.
Oh, awesome.
I've got
Okay.
my
I've
phone.
got the receipt.
So the first one was "God Alone" by Altar of Plagues.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I love that song. I love that band. I think it's very like I draw on them in the first chapter particularly because I talk about distortion as being like a kind of how do I put it? Like a divergence from an ideal, right? And I think like Altar of Plagues on that album particularly like tried to go as far as they could like with what they did as a band. Like their first two songs were very traditional like post black metal, atmospheric black metal, what have you. But I love what they did with that album. I wrote a thing about it recently for Astral Noise because it's come up it's coming up to its 10-year anniversary really soon. And yeah, it's one of it's probably my favorite album ever. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Second one was Fire Sermon by Dawn Raid.
Never heard of them.
Never heard of Dawn Raid.
Yeah, it's one of those things that like that is always kind of a worry with black metal. When you said to me that like oh you have to like you've got a rough like 30-minute mark in terms of the like what music you have, like okay, so like the black metal that I would listen to normally, that's like 2 songs.
That's
Yeah,
what Margaret Killjoy said as well.
So it's very much, and I think I'm gonna start making a point of saying this, that it isn't as hard and fast as that. If it goes to be 40 or 50 minutes or whatever, like just yeah, like just feel free to it's more just kind of like very vague guideline of what we're asking for, but if it goes over by a considerable amount, we're not going to complain either.
No, that's no problem. So really, I chose that just because, like, I think Dawn Raid, like, I think without the violin, like at least on their earlier albums, without the violin, they'd probably be considered much more traditional than most black metal I listen to. Like they do recall that kind of very old school stuff like Dark Throne. Um, Obviously the violin does bring in that like English folk element that we spoke about. But I don't know, it's just a nice short song and it has cool politics that I agree with.
Yeah, the chorus, and what's like rarer for Dawn Raid, which is like a thing that I actually think is like an intentional thing. So this isn't a criticism, but they tend to shy away from like choruses and stuff like that. So like that's one of like the rare instances where I think it does actually have a recurring chorus with like the like the fire burn is the signal bit.
Yeah, true.
So like it's interesting for that fact alone.
But you were saying you wish that bit at the end of Battle of Sudden Flame was the chorus, but I'm like, no, those two going throughs of that fuck every copper ever took a wage is like it goes hard. I don't think that needs to be any longer or shorter than it is.
I will agree to disagree with you.
And then I can't open my phone.
Well, you have such a long, complicated
I
password.
do. Don't dox my password. Entirely simple password. It's a tangent. So we were at the gig last night, and your card got blocked because you banked with the co-op because
I found out
because
what
of
it
Jeremy
was.
Corbyn.
Yeah, like yes, again, the Labour Party fucks over
Anyway,
the working man.
we'll get past
Anyway.
this. So I've got Apple Pay and I have my card. So Scal Malta just played. You went to the bar. I was like, I'm going to the merch booth. I'll take my card. You take my phone. So I had to give you my password. And then my card got blocked because I don't know. They must have thought I was been frauded or something. But yeah,
Okay.
that's a very
yeah.
that's a story and a tangent as to why you don't know my passcode of my phone. And then there was King of Kings by Akvan. Akvan.
I actually don't. I think it's Akwan because like I don't know for some reason that's how it. No. I know it's Akvan when you say it in like when it's read in English, but if you read it in Arabic, it says Akwan, which I've never really understood why they do that. But um, I chose that song in King of Kings is because I talk about Akvan almost as how you could talk about like Burzum but from Iran, being like Akvan, the music and stated in interviews and stuff is very Iranian nationalism. But specifically like the nationalism that they're interested in is like pre-Islam. So
Oh,
they draw on a lot of like Zoroastrian mythology and poetry and that sort of thing. And so the album that comes from is called Forgotten Glory. Um, and really like the whole point of the album is that like Iran has been kind of destroyed by Islam. This is the album's philosophy, I should point out. That Iran has been destroyed by like Islam and kind of the incursion of like Arab culture, I suppose, and that the point is to like return to like the forgotten glory of Iran from before, I think the 700s
so like the kind
when
of Persian
Islam
Empire.
arrived. Yeah,
So it's kind of like
yeah.
harking back to like like Xerxes, Darius the Great, all of that kind of. That's really
That just makes me think of 300.
well, yeah. That's who I was referencing.
I know, yeah, but I don't do history really.
But
Unless it's film history, but
yeah, but like that was a really interesting. I've not listened to that band before. That's a really interesting comparison because it's obviously Varg's whole thing is, pre-Christian Europe and kind of hit again Varg's philosophy, not mine. The reclamation of that pre-Christian culture, and that was kind of like the thing that like inspired all the church burnings. It had very little to do with Satanism. It was they built these beautiful wooden stave churches, which like I like genuinely like I'm not a Christian, but they're gorgeous to look at. On ancient pagan holy sites, because like it was a way of like kind of asserting their god's superiority over
Yeah.
recently defeated
Was a flex.
pagans. Yeah, basically. Like they'd be like, like the groves and glades and like sacred sites of pagans where they would meet, they would build churches on as a kind of fuck you. Sorry, yeah. But yeah, it was an interesting comparison between like Vogue's version of that with Northern European culture and Iranian culture, and I'm going to check that album out.
Well, I'm going to segue from you saying about land reclamation and all this stuff to the next pick was Circle Chant by Agriculture.
Yeah, I just chose that because they're sick. They're I do listen to other genres, but like besides black metal, like but so pretty much since I finished writing the book, it's all like I've taken a pretty big break from black metal. But Agriculture are still one of those new bands that have proven themselves to be very good and very interesting. And I think they've recently been signed by the Flenser, who were a very cool label. Um, who I think the Flenser also do Chat Pile, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I expect very good things. And like I think that album, that whole album by Agriculture is literally like 10 minutes long. Um, yeah, but that song's great. I love their approach, and I want to see what they do. Yeah.
Awesome.
And then the replacement for the Deathblow Mega one was Eine letzte Schlacht by Allura, or Lura.
Yeah. I think it's Allura. I don't speak German. Um, I I chose that song because I draw on Allura or Illura for the secrecy chapter in the book, because the whole their whole album that comes from, what's it called, the Herrschaft der Sonne. um it's sort of, it pitches the sun as like a force of oppression, and it enjoys like reveling in that kind of darkness, um, which I like, and I think that's and they're an explicitly anti-fascist band, so I thought they were a good way of like a good salve for me initially suggesting a Death Spell Omega song. Um,
All is forgiven.
so I think that album's really good, and that song's really good. Can't understand what the lyrics are because they're in German. Um, but yeah, they seem very cool. And like the Allura and Agriculture like inclusions are literally just a shout out to very good bands.
Awesome.
That's
Well,
very good.
yeah, thank you for guiding
And
us through
then
these picks. And is that not the end?
There was also, we asked, since it's about a book, for
Yes.
book picks. And they were Jonas Saker, How to Philosophize with a Hammer and Sickle, and then Transcendental Black Metal by Ravina Hunt Hendricks, Of the Refrain by Deleuze and Guattari, and then Black Metal Rainbows, and then Girls Against God. So just want to...
Yep. Well, so the first three, I don't draw on so the book How to Philosophize with the Hammer and Sickle, that kind of tries to do with Nietzsche what I'm trying to do with black metal. Like I already think black metal is like, Nietzsche is a fairly common reference in black metal, and I think for good reason. But obviously, Nietzsche's personal politics, big like aristocrat, reactionary, whatever. But that book, what Jonas Chaker is like attempting to do is to try to like make a connection between Nietzsche and Marx as two great like German thinkers about, who are talking specifically about like industrial capitalism and modernity, and trying to imagine what might come after that, I suppose. And yeah, and it's also by Repeater, who are the publisher of my book, which, they're a very cool publisher. Um, what was the next one? Of the Refrain. Yeah, that I draw on that. Oh yeah, by Deleuze and Guattari. I specifically draw on that for the distortion chapter quite a bit, and their idea of like getting stuck in repetition. And that I think it's interesting because it's one of the few times where they talk about music, and they say that the refrain is like this kind of small block of repetition in music, and you can either get stuck in that sort of infinite repetition and infinite territorialization in their kind of over the top Frenchy language, or that like each refrain, each kind of block also serves as a springboard onto other stuff, which is kind of the approach that I tried to kind of replicate in that chapter. Or it's a I talked about black metal kind of deterritorializing those refrains and kind of not getting stuck in infinite repetition and infinite kind of self-aggrandizement. And yeah, I loving black metal that uses the older acts as a springboard, I suppose. What was the other one? Sorry, it was
Transcendental Black Metal,
oh
by Ravina Hunt Hendricks.
yeah. So I mean, it's just a classic. Um, she was going by Hunter Hunt Hendricks. I think she goes by Ravenna Hunter Hunt Hendricks these days. That's the main musician from Liturgy.
Oh
The
yeah,
new album. Yeah,
that's where I
the new
recognize the
album is
name
very
from.
good.
Yeah, I still listen
Yes.
to the new album yet, but I will do.
Yeah. The that sort of manifesto got very how do I put it? Got unfairly maligned, in my opinion, like when it came out, because like this was during the peak era of like hipster hate or whatever. So liturgy kind of got thrown in there and like got I think unfairly criticized for trying to like intellectualize black metal and kind of drawing on these references from like Nietzsche and Hegel and this kind of thing. Um and it's also one of the references that I constantly go back to in the book. Like I think the actual manifesto is only like 10 pages long, like it's not particularly extensive. But it's got a lot of ideas in it that I draw from pretty regularly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry, what were the oh sorry, there were two
I was
more.
just gonna say I find when I first listened to Liturgy, it was like I've not really heard anything like that before. Like because it takes like there's like hip
Hmm.
hoppy elements to it and everything. It's like yeah, I it might be like post metal, maybe like post black metal, maybe, but it's like not like how you'd imagine it, like Death Heaven and that, where it's more like shoegazy. It's more like I don't know, it just because they were all like like classically trained musicians, or have I got that wrong? They went to like a music
I believe so.
yeah.
I don't know
So
that.
they're very like very technically like fluent, I guess the word. Yeah. I'll just grab the other uh two takes. One of them was Black Metal Rainbows. That was one.
Yeah, that was the
Yep.
last one, wasn't it?
Oh, okay, so yeah, Black Metal Rainbows. I I I haven't read the whole thing, full disclosure. I've read a fair bit of it, but I only just picked up my copy fairly recently. But I think it's just another good incursion into black metal from a left-wing perspective, and it's trying to do something very different than my book. It's trying to like its influences seem to draw more from like art criticism and queer theory and literary criticism, that sort of thing. Um, Whereas I'm drawing from more traditional, like socialist, communist, anarchist politics and philosophy, whatever. But I think the two books will always kind of have this relationship of like we try to do, you know, a similar enough thing in a similar enough time, and you know, they're just cool people, so I thought it was worth a shout out.
Yeah, I've got my copy of it and I've got some of the way through it, but sometimes with books I'm like when it's like that, I'm like I don't want to rush through them too quickly. Like I've got a copy of Animal Man by Grant Morrison. I'm halfway through it, or just over halfway through it, and have been for years because I'm like, once I finish that, it's not, it's it's not there
But
anymore.
then you can start the Invisibles, which is even better.
That's true. It's why it's taken me so long to finish Return of the King, because it's like once I finish my first reading of all the whole trilogy of Lord of the Rings, I can't do it again. Yeah. Then
It's over.
yeah, very pessimistic. I'm not a pessimist, I swear. But the last book pick was Girls Against God by Jenny Haval?
I think it's Haval. Yeah, wouldn't know. That's a really interesting book. It's a novel. I think it's like meant to be like a semi-fictionalized memoir kind of thing about Jenny Haval growing up in Norway during like the peak black metal years. But it's a very weird book. So like the fictionalized element is that like she forms like a three-person band with two of her female friends, and they almost end up forming like a witches' coven slash like insurrectionary artistic unit or whatever. Um, and the book is very interested in treating black metal, like I said before, like as a springboard to try to do other things. Like they're just bizarre divergences. And I just love it. Yeah, it's how do I put it? And quite early, like before I wrote the book, I wrote a kind of review of the book for an Australian publication called Overland. It's not really a review, it's more just an essay about it and like what it does with black metal. Um, but it's you could almost attach it with black metal rainbows in that it's like it's trying to turn black metal into this like more imaginative, more rainbow colored form. Um, it's just it imagines like what if black metal ended differently? Like instead of the church burnings, you could have raves, for example. It's just it's a fascinating book. And yeah, it's not too short as well. So if you're not a big reader and you're really, really into black metal, um, absolutely suggest it.
I'm just trying to imagine black metal raves now. I think that'd be a very strange but kind of cool experience.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm very tired.
Yeah, how late is it over there for you guys? I should say, like,
20 to 9 at the moment.
Yeah, it's only the fact that I'm functioning off next to no sleep from the night before. So
yeah,
Yeah.
that is almost past my bedtime. So I respect that.
No, honestly, we're massively very happy to have had you on the podcast and stuff. Again, apologies for maybe not being as lucid as I would have liked to have been and a bit rambly.
You're usually
No, it's no problem. I ramble too.
rambling's the best. It's a podcast.
I
so
usually circle back to a point though when I ramble,
True,
whereas I
true.
don't feel like I've been doing that tonight.
And I think it's been my week off this week, so we've hammered so much things. Like I'm like,
Fourth podcast we've
fourth
recorded.
podcast recorded in the week, and then we've got some other stuff we've been doing as well. And it's like, I'm like, it's a week off technically, but it's a week off from wage slavery, not from.
Yes.
And then we've got like a few like in-person interviews with Swallow the Sun and Draconian tomorrow.
Nice.
And then Black Metal Rainbows Sunday?
Yeah, we're interviewing those Sunday. And that's the last thing we've got booked.
The last of the week of 1,000 podcasts.
Yeah, the week of 1,000 podcasts. But yeah, so do you want to just like tell us where we can find your book and when it's out and everything?
Yeah, sure. So because of delay issues, the ebook comes out, what is it, on the 11th? On the 11th of April, I should say. And I don't actually remember off the top of my head when the physical book comes out because it's a bunch of different locations. But if you go to